Okay, before I jump into the presentation content proper, just a little background information about myself. I'm an intergenerational survivor, and my mother, as well as her siblings, parents, grandparents, and extended family attended residential schools here in Canada, 3 of which are in the Qu'Appelle Valley, which are located in Saskatchewan, which are Maryville, Round Lake, and Qu'Appelle, and then one located in Alberta, Crowfoot. So in addition to having worked, or I should say, having listened to the stories of my mother's experience and her family's experience in residential schools, I also worked for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada as a statement gatherer. So the images you now see on screen are of the statement gatherers, senior archivists, and senior staff at the TRC. There are in fact over 158 personnel who worked at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's statement gathering unit, but only a small number actually made it through the full commission. Myself and one other out of the original 25 statement gatherers trained were the only ones to make it through the full 5 years plus the 1-year extension. And a lot of that had to do with vicarious trauma and the burden of taking on some of those stories. A lot of the statement gatherers learned that they could only take 1, 2, 3, maybe a couple statements, and that was as much as they were able to carry. Now, when it comes to the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, here's a little bit of a lead up. The first apology we ever saw released regarding the treatment of Indigenous peoples by the churches came in 1986 by the United Church after activist Alberta Billy reached out to the United Church Executive Council and demanded an apology. Now, this wasn't an apology about residential schools, but about the treatment of Indigenous peoples through their missionary work. It would take until 1998 for them to apologize for residential schools. Now, throughout the 80s, all throughout the 90s, that's when institutions or organizations released their apologies for the treatment of Indigenous peoples and missionary work in residential schools and assimilation. Now, in 1990, we had then Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, Phil Fontaine, go on public news at CBC and give an interview about his treatment at the Fort Alexander Residential School here in Manitoba. And that's where he described the widespread abuse within these institutions and issued his want to do a meeting with the Archdiocese of St. Boniface to do an inquiry when it came to the treatment of those children. Now, throughout the 80s and 90s, that's where we had residential school survivors in Canada really start to come forward to talk about their treatment, but also look for compensation through the formal court system. And so in 1998 and 1999, the federal government, as well as church officials and Indigenous organizations, began to have dialogues or discuss what it would look like to address all in one go kind of the full amount of litigation that had started to arise. Now, by 2001, the number of cases going through the formal court system reached 8,500, and it was estimated by 2005 that number jumped to 18 to 20,000. It was then that the Assembly of Chiefs actually released a report regarding how much money it was going to cost the federal government if they were to see all cases go through the formal court system, and it would have bankrupted the country and put a full freeze on the formal court system. So the class action settlement was seen as an option for them to address all of this. Now, it was in 2005 that we got the Blackwater versus Pliant Supreme Court case, which sought acknowledgement for the harms and abuses that children suffered in residential school, as well as compensation, and determined what the split was when it came to responsibility of the federal government as well as the churches. Now, within that, a year later, negotiations were approved between the legal advisors of the survivors, of the churches, of the Assembly of First Nations, the governments, and other organizations to implement what's called the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, also known as the IRSA Agreement or simply the Settlement Agreement. Now, this document states very, very simply that harms and abuses occurred to children who attended residential schools, and this was a way to formally recognize and establish a fair, comprehensive, and lasting resolution to the history and legacy of residential schools. Now, when it comes to the settlement agreement, what I've just put up on screen is a pictorial representation of the different components. 2 are compensation-based, the common experience payment and the independent assessment process. But there are also funds set aside for the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. $125 million were distributed to grassroots organizations across Canada. Once that money was distributed, they then closed their doors. There was also funds set aside for commemoration initiatives. There was $20 million for 144 of these initiatives to pay tribute, honor, recognize, and remember those who were impacted by the residential school system. We also had the creation of what's called the Resolution Health Support Program, which is still operating today, which offers psychological, counseling, emotional, and elder support to residential school survivors, but also the family and those impacted by that history. There was also the creation of the 24-hour crisis line, which is still in operation today. Now, just due to time, I'm not going to dive too heavy deep into this section, but I did want to touch upon one area that's really important given the recent occurrences in the news. And that is related to what's called the IAP, the Independent Assessment Process. And this is an out-of-court adjudication process for the claims of physical, sexual abuse, as well as other wrongful acts. And so individuals would submit their application detailing who, what happened, where it happened in as much detail as possible, to which then they would be brought in front of the adjudicate, who would hear their case and then issue an adjudication, a judgment as to how much compensation they would receive. There are over 38,000 claims filed with over 26,000 hearings, $3.2 billion worth of compensation, with the average amount being $113,000. Now, you may have heard the destruction of records. Now, records collected by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission are safe, and I'll cover those after I touch upon the IAP. But what is for destruction are the records collected by the independent assessment process. Now, this was related to a court case we unfortunately lost in the Supreme Court of Canada, where the Truth Commission, the National Centre, and Library and Archives Canada fought to have the records saved. However, the chief adjudicator of the IAP, as well as 24 Catholic churches, argued they should be destroyed. The reason for this is that some survivors were told their records would be saved, others were told that they would be destroyed. So the Supreme Court determined that because survivors had already passed and could not make that choice, they would destroy those records. And so all IAP records, including the application, the decision, the audio transcript, and the hearing, will be destroyed September 19th, 2027. And so survivors have to be alive, and they are the ones who have to make that choice. If they've already passed on, their families can't make that choice for them. And so individuals can decide to have a copy of the record sent to them, have a copy sent to our center, do both, or do nothing and let those records disappear. Now, why it's such a loss is for the fact that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission collected statements from about 7,000 individuals, which is a drop in the bucket compared to the 38,000 individuals who applied for compensation. Now, the reason why there was such a stark difference is while both processes were about gathering truth, one was a much longer duration. The IAP was from 2007 to 2020. It was also able to provide compensation to those who were impacted. Unfortunately, with the TRC, it was a much shorter duration, 6 years total. And if you remember to the image I showed earlier of what that settlement agreement looked like, they were little silos, and that's exactly that. Unfortunately, the commissioners at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission couldn't transfer files to the IAP. Likewise, the IAP Secretariat could not transfer any stories or files to the TRC. And on one piece that we learned from survivors is oftentimes they had the strength to tell their story once, and oftentimes they are choosing to tell their story with that possibility of finding compensation or the recognition of those harms and funds for healing. Now, why I'm bringing this up now is related to missing children and unmarked burials. When the original decision was made by the Supreme Court, they did not take into account missing children and unmarked burials. And so Kim Murray, the independent special interlocutor for the Office of Missing Children and Unmarked Burials, has made a call for us to re-examine IAP records for information that might assist in work related to missing children and unmarked burials. As you can see on my slide here, out of 38,000 files, our center has received a total of 27. We live in an era where people can deny the Holocaust, the Holodomor, gross human rights violations. We're seeing it now with the rise of residential school denialism. What people are demanding, let us see the evidence, let us see these bodies, is what we're hearing. In fact, the community of Kamloops had released the fact that after their announcement in 2021, there were individuals who came upon the property with shovels, hoping to dig up and find the evidence themselves. Now, in addition to that, we are still waiting for millions of records to come to our center. Recently, the Standing Senate Committee on Indigenous Peoples held a meeting, and they determined that there were 6 recommendations they were going to make to the federal government to support our center, the NCTR, to support the Office of the Special Interlocutor, but also to ensure that institutions that were to provide records to our center would do so at an expedited rate. And this fall, we're hoping to see a hearing held where those institutions will be able to come forward and talk about why they have not met their responsibilities and what they're going to do to address them. So given the prominent nature of missing children and unmarked burials, as well as the ever-changing nature of the collection of records, I wanted to talk about that first before jumping into those other areas. At our center, we have approximately 3 to 5 million items, and we are growing every day. In fact, we are waiting for 6 million new records related to federal day schools across Canada. And then the original estimate for new records related to residential schools was 10 to 15 million. It's now up to 23 million new records we are expecting to bring in from the government and churches. So what's unique about our center, because we are primarily an archive, is for the fact that 95% of our holdings are digitized. They're on computer servers, and over time we are proactively releasing more and more records to the public. So if you visit our website, you can get access to about 62,000 items today, with about 36,000 text documents, 21,000 photographs, both contemporary and historical, as well as over 1,200 videos. And those videos include survivor statements from those who shared in front of the TRC commissioners, in sharing circles amongst themselves, but also special event videos and mini documentaries. In 2022, we released over 4,000 new records to the database, and we'll continue to release those records over time. So if you're looking to access records, this is what our main archival webpage looks like, and this is the URL. It's archives.nctr.ca. And so when it comes to our work, we really want to ensure we're engaging in a balancing act. Our primary guiding principle is we do not want to cause more harm than good by releasing this information. So while we want to be open and transparent about our archives and activities, we also want to ensure we're protecting the privacy of those mentioned in these records, as well as to be accountable and to fulfill our mandate. So when it comes to what is our mandate, what does the NCTR do? Well, we are here to ensure the protection and safety of all the documents, statements, and materials collected by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we're here to ensure survivors and families have access to their history, that educators can share this history in the schools with their students, that researchers can delve deeper into the mysteries that still exist. And no matter where I give my presentations and when I talk about our mandate and research, I always bring up the work of Ian Mosby, a researcher out of Ontario, who in 2013 released the article about the nutritional experiments happening in residential schools. We do know that there's still so many mysteries that exist. We know that there's a strong connection between Albertan residential schools as well as the Albertan Eugenics Board. We've heard stories of students being forcibly taken to hospitals to be sterilized without their knowledge and consent. And we know that this is still a problem that we have here in Canada, with women being coerced into tubal litigations during labor, predominantly Indigenous women and women of color. Now, the last two pieces, the history and the public, we're here to ensure we can help foster healing and reconciliation with the content in our archive, but also ensure that this history and legacy are never forgotten or repeated. Now, survivor and family access is paramount. Since 2017, we've had over 1,400 plus requests from survivors. And that isn't just individual peoples. Those requests can have multiple persons. Our largest file is of 14 siblings. And in fact, when it comes to how many records will they receive, it depends on what survives. In some cases, unfortunately, there are no records that survive because that school had suffered a fire, a flood, or just destruction of records. And in other cases, we have many, many records. For one individual, one of the largest files, they received over 2,000 pages of material. Now, when it comes to general requests, we've received almost 3,000. It's 2,992 from survivors, from the communities, from media, as well as researchers. And that's more than the previous 2 years combined. And what really was that tipping point was the May 2021 announcement of unmarked burials at Kamloops. Now, what I really like about our archive is this quote that was said by George Erasmus at a 2021 forum on the National Research Center, as originally they didn't know what our center was going to look like. And so what it reads is, if the stories of our people are not accessible to the general public, it'll be as if those experiences never occurred. And if those voices are rendered merely as museum pieces, it will be as if the experience is frozen in time. What we need are open, dynamic, and interactive spaces and participatory forms of narrative, knowledge, and research. And this is a very fitting way to step into a new relationship and into a new kind of century. And really with that, it's one of the reasons why I like to engage with our archives, bring out the stories, bring out the experiences using these documents to the public, for the fact that when you take a look at the news these days, oftentimes what you're seeing are the numbers. For instance, how many residential schools there are? Well, it depends, but 140 is the usual call. How many unmarked burials are there? It's hard to say at this point in time, but how many children have we confirmed who have died? Well, at the NCTR, we know it's at least 4,137, and that number continues to grow on a weekly basis as we look through records in our collection. We just entered phase 2 of stage 2 of our Missing Children project, where we looked at 2.19 million new records and identified about 400,000 that need additional hands-on research to identify children mentioned in those records. So really, we're just beginning to scratch the surface, which started in 2007, and there's still decades more of work that lies ahead of us. Which then kind of leads to this question of, why does reconciliation matter? Why does this matter at all? And really, I believe I'm speaking or preaching to the choir, as they say. But Canada, of course, is a country that's been built on relationships, same with the United States and their Indigenous peoples. So residential schools or boarding schools are part of this history, and it's a great injustice if we were to ignore that it occurred and not listen to those who have talked about those experiences. The reason why this matters today is for the fact that the inequalities caused by these systems of oppression still exist today. Now, while none of us in this room had anything to do with the creation of these systems, the fact that we're living in these two countries has everything to do about it, because it's not whether or not we're personally responsible, but in indirect ways, we're all kind of benefiting from the subjugation of Indigenous peoples. Now, we don't ask those who experience gross rights, human violations to forget about what happened. And the statement that there are still those impacted is distressing. We don't like to hear simply by living, working, playing in our communities and urban settings that we are negatively impacting other communities. It conflicts with the idea that we have about ourselves, our self-concepts, and we want to feel good about ourselves and we want to help others. So that question is always, what can we do? And that's what I hope to answer at the end and give you some resources to go away with to help expand your own education and knowledge, but your colleagues as well. Now, one question we're often asked, or we often hear, is when it comes to Indigenous topics, Indigenous history, when is it going to be enough? When will it be enough for us to put money into this or attention into this? And so I have a quote from Dr. Ava Jewell and Ian Mosby, who wrote the 2021 and 2022 status update on the calls to action from the Yellowhead Institute. And their answer was, it will be enough when the systems of oppression no longer exist. We are going to arrive at reconciliation when Indigenous peoples on this land, at the barest minimum, can say that they're living those healthy, prosperous visions of what those communities should look like. And really, that's what all communities want. So in this next little section, as we continue to move forward, I just want you to hold in your head the question of, what is reconciliation? It's a very big word, and depending who you ask, you're going to get a million different answers. So I really want you to think about, what does reconciliation look like? What does it entail? What are concepts or ideas that are core as being necessary for reconciliation? Now, if you go to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report, you will find a definition that says reconciliation is the ongoing process of establishing but also maintaining respectful relationship. And exploring respectful relationships, these are some of the terms or ideas that came across. that everyone has the right to feel safe, to be treated with fairness, to be valued and feel accepted for who they are. It's about safety, encouragement, caring, trust, honesty, the freedom to be yourself, to be valued, and to be listened to. Now, critical to reconciliation, the TRC, was the need to repair damaged trust. And trust can be repaired in a number of ways, such as making apologies. In 2022, in July, we had Pope Francis visit Canada and visit the community of Ochapowace, where he issued an apology on behalf of the Catholic Church. We also have the providing individual and collective reparations. And reparations don't necessarily have to be funds. Reparations can take a number of different depictions, avenues, and I'll share a few of those. But the big one, the heavy-hitting one, is following through with actions that demonstrate real societal change. So when it comes to what are some other perspectives about reconciliation, I'm going to share with you a few youth perspectives. So in 2019, the Environics Institute worked with the MasterCard Foundation and the Canadian Roots Exchange to ask youth, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, a variety of questions related to reconciliation, one of them being, what is reconciliation? So the most common theme the youth had brought up was rebuilding relationships and trust, which used terms like getting along, respect, and restoring relations. The second most common theme was about apologies and making amends, and that was described as acknowledging past wrongs as well as forgiveness, with the third theme being focusing on repair and correcting the past. And so that included things like making things better, correcting past wrongs. Now, what I really like about reconciliation, at least from my perspective, is the full spectrum that it can take. Depending on who you ask, as I said, you might get a different definition. And I think reconciliation looks differently depending on the relationship level. Most oftentimes, in the news and in organizations, we're really focusing on the macro level depiction of reconciliation. So our big picture, it's changes to the nation, changes to the economic, the political, the healthcare system, the education system, the justice system. And because that is where we need a lot of change and we're not seeing change happen fast enough, it can be very easy for us to get disempowered or feel like there's nothing happening because we aren't really seeing that. Now, if we take a look at reconciliation at the meso level, at communities, neighborhoods, schools, and organizations, and at the micro level, between individuals, families, and those community groups, we see there are lots of really great pockets of reconciliation. Now, at that community level, we see it through public sharing circle spaces, intercultural gatherings, the use of territorial acknowledgements or land acknowledgements at events. We also see it through the change of policies, procedures in businesses and organizations. Now, at the micro level, for Indigenous individuals, intergenerational survivors, it can look like reconnecting with history or a language that may have been impacted due to these colonial traumas. And for non-Indigenous individuals, for settlers, it can look like learning more about Indigenous history and culture. Now, as I said, I wanted to share just a few examples of what I believe reconciliation can look like very broadly, and how there's a potential that it can be looked at a little negatively too. And so the first one I wanted to share is the Tim Hortons Orange Sprinkle Donut. So this was launched in 2021 by two intergenerational survivors who owned a Tim Hortons franchise location in Kamloops. There was something they wanted to do to support those survivors, and so they launched this campaign to raise funds where money for every orange sprinkle donut that was sold was then collected for charities. That first year it was for the Indian Residential School Survivor Society, and in 2022 they added the Orange Shirt Society, the James Smith Cree Nation, the New Pathways Foundation, as well as the Indian Residential School Survivor Society. Now, while there is a valid criticism that say that sometimes these campaigns can encourage the commodification of reconciliation, and that is a risk, but I also see it's very important as getting out there, as it is reaching individuals who may not have bought in interest to reconciliation or the understanding of it. So it's exposing others to this history, to this knowledge, through something as simple as an orange donut. But other ways that can take a charge or take a difference is the renaming of buildings, of streets, tearing down of statues. So here in Winnipeg, we have 3 streets or 3 areas named after Bishop Grandin, who was a bishop for St. Boniface and who wanted more residential schools built in Canada and campaigned for more residential schools. Now, with that, this past March 2023, our city's council voted to change Bishop Grandin Boulevard to Abinogi Mikana, meaning a child's path or a children's road in Anishinaabe-Moan or Ojibwe. Bishop Grandin Trail was named Awasak Mesikanau, meaning children's row in Inawin. And then Grandin Street in St. Boniface was renamed Tapaway-Win Way, meaning truth in Michif. Now, depending who you ask, again, there's a whole spectrum as to whether or not we should be tearing down statues, changing plaques, changing names of streets. And depending who you ask, you're going to get a little bit of a different answer. A good example is the Honorable Murray Sinclair, one of the TRC commissioners, said, before tearing things down, what we should do is further expand. And so as an example, I've brought up Duncan Campbell Scott's plaque at Beechwood Cemetery. Duncan Campbell Scott was the Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, which managed the residential school system. And his original plaque talked about his accomplishments as a Confederate poet. Now, one of our activists here in Canada, Cindy Blackstock, who works with the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society and lives in Ottawa, visited this and said this wasn't right. So she worked with the Beechwood Cemetery and other organizations to have the plaque amended. And while it still talks about Duncan Campbell Scott's achievements when it comes to his work as a Confederate poet, it also now talks about how he oversaw the assimilation and colonial policies of the residential school system, and how the Truth and Reconciliation Commission determined that that amounted to cultural genocide. Very similarly, they had a plaque erected for Peter Henderson Bryce, the early whistleblower who talked about the horrific numbers of deaths in residential schools thanks to tuberculosis. Now, he originally had a position as the medical officer for the Interior and Indian Affairs, but when he wanted to release his report, he was silenced, ostracized, pushed out of the federal government. So in 1922, he published his own report. And so Cindy Blackstock had his own plaque amended, but you can also see his grave in Beechwood Cemetery has grown from that single little stone itself to including a mailbox, other little gifts and things. And so people can actually write letters to Peter Henderson Bryce that are sent to Beechwood Cemetery and go here. But other areas, when we look at justice, include the creation or renaming of parks. Ted Fontaine, or Theodore Fontaine, was an elder and survivor who passed away in 2021 who envisioned a memorial to honor survivors at the former residential school here in Winnipeg called Assiniboia. It's still standing today. You can actually drive past it on Academy Road. Now, in 2022, Wellington Park, which was north of the former school, was officially renamed in his honor. Now, this land was very special to him. It symbolized a place where he and other students could come out, not be supervised, dominated, and observed. And so the pictures that you see are of his wife, Morgan Fontaine, and of the information plaque that was built in just last summer. Now, the last one I'll touch upon before I move into these barriers is the search for justice. Now, most recently, there was a court case that went through the King's Bench here in Manitoba. It was related to a young girl who had been assaulted at the Fort Alexander School in the 1960s. And unfortunately, the individual who had been accused, Arthur Massey, was acquitted in that case. And that was one of the first cases since the TRC that has come through in our system. But there are other cases out there, and there are other groups outside of Canada that are fighting for more awareness and education on this issue. So the Public Prosecution Service of Canada asked France to extradite an individual named Johann Rouvoir, a priest who was accused of crimes committed against children in Nunavut between the 1960s and 1993. Unfortunately, France traditionally does not extradite its citizens. However, there is a grassroots organization in France called Be Brave France that has come together to hold gatherings outside of this individual's home, as well as to demand the French government act to extradite this individual. So there have been petitions created with over 13,000 signatories, as well as a letter writing campaign to President Emmanuel Macron, as well as plans to hold more demonstrations. Now, when it comes to wanting to address reconciliation and the potential barriers to it, That Environics Institute also asked youth what were the biggest barriers. And so these were some of the most common themes that emerged. Number one were myths and stereotypes about Indigenous people and what they receive. The second was the lack of political leadership willing to implement change. And the third was a lack of knowledge about Indigenous history and culture. Now, non-Indigenous youth, they presented a very similar order, but at their top was social economic inequalities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, followed by myths and stereotypes, and then that lack of political leadership willing to implement change. And there are several documents that have echoed very similar sentiments. So I'm going to share with you what are called the 4 pathways of oppression. So we here have had in Canada the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit Inquiry to explore and examine the causes of violence and the pathways to violence that Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people face. And so what they identified is that the more that these 4 pathways intersected with one another, the more likely someone would experience violence. And so that included historical, multi-generational, intergenerational trauma. So that's things like the residential school system, the 60s scoop or the forced adoptions, the day schools, the Indian hospitals and sanatoriums, or more recent things like the loss of a loved one. Included social and economic marginalization, with Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people experiencing some of the highest rates of poverty. The third was institutions and governments maintaining the status quo and a lack of willingness to implement change. And the fourth is the ignoring the agency and expertise Indigenous people hold. Now, why I wanted to share this in this next piece is, again, you're going to see some themes that are found throughout all of this literature. So in 2021, the Yellowhead Institute released their status update about the 94 calls to action and included 5 major barriers to reconciliation. Number 1, paternalism, a deep-rooted, ongoing paternalistic attitude that politicians, policymakers, and those in power result in saying we know best, which prevents Indigenous peoples from making changes and leading the charge. The second is structural anti-Indigenous discrimination, so the assertion of these legal myths like the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius to justify the disposition of Indigenous lands. Now, while the Vatican has since rejected the concept of the doctrine of discovery, it's going to take some time, I think, before that's really reflected in our laws. The third is the public interest, or more like the lack of public interest. So policymakers, legal teams using the lack of interest of non-Indigenous individuals to shore up their inaction, saying, you know what, it doesn't matter to most people, so we're not going to touch upon it. The fourth is insufficient resources, so we get tons of promises, but with ongoing rampant funding inequalities, reconciliation is out of reach. And then the fifth, reconciliation used as exploitation and performance. And this we really saw during the pandemic with the tearing down and attack on the Unistoten and Wet'suwet'en land-based camps in British Columbia that were protesting the Delpa pipeline, where we had the federal government declaring we're entering a new age of reconciliation and a new relationship, yet sending the RCMP or the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to dismantle these camps in a violent fashion. Now, while there are the calls that reconciliation is dead, I don't take that perspective because of what I shared earlier, those different perspectives of reconciliation at that individual as well as community level. Now, there are a couple other pieces I wanted to highlight, observations that the Yellowhead Institute has made. One being that the calls to action that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released, not all of them require lasting permanent change. There are some calls to action that are low-hanging fruit, that are very easily able to do, whereas others, such as those that do require structural change, are being neglected. And the second observation is that the calls to action, they've really been treated like a tally list, much like the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples recommendations, much like the 231 calls for justice for the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people, where people say the more that we can check off, the closer we are to reconciliation. And unfortunately, because reconciliation is an ongoing process about maintenance and about commitment, it cannot be addressed by a single event or a single accomplishment. There is no finish line to say we've achieved reconciliation and we can close the book on it. Now, in the 2022 report, there are a couple other observations they made. Number one is that they were going to report on the exact same things they reported in 2021 because there were no changes made. And so what they did instead is they interviewed a number of experts to talk about some of these areas that need to be addressed. And so what they said is a lack of transparency from the governments and institutions make it impossible to take the government's claims that they're addressing the calls to action seriously. Now, there are 4 calls to action in specific, number 2, 9, 19, and 30, and those are related to the number of children, Indigenous children in care, the education and employment gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth, the health gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, and the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the justice system, where until we really start to collect accurate, measurable data, we will be unable to determine if we're actually making meaningful progress towards towards the completion of the calls to action and towards reconciliation. So when it comes to how many of the calls to action are completed, there is conflicting information because there's a subjective nature to them. Now, right now, 3 institutions, the Yellowhead Institute, CBC Beyond 94, and the Indigenous Watchdog, all state that there are 13 calls to action that have been completed. But if you take a look at the numbers, they're telling you there are different calls to action that are being completed. There are some that are shared, like number 94, as well as number 84. No, actually not even 84, but number 94, which is the citizenship oath, that has been recognized all over, but there are some that have not been. Now, actions have been determined to be largely symbolic, gestures towards addressing those easily hanging fruit calls to action. Ian Mosby has stated that if the current trend holds, that we address 13 calls to action within these 8 years, that the calls to action won't all be addressed until 2057. Now, in quick succession, right after the Kamloops announcement, there were 3 calls to action that were completed, number 15, number 80, and number 94. The appointment of the Office of the Commissioner of Indigenous Languages, the establishment of a federal statutory day for truth and reconciliation, and the amendment to the citizenship oath. So the question is, how genuine are efforts so far being made to address those calls to action? Now, if we take a look overall, when it comes to the calls to action, there are 94 of them, as I mentioned, in 22 thematic topic areas, everything from child welfare to new Canadians, and including ones that are very specific to media, numbers 84, 85, and 86. Now, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission developed these calls to action to redress the legacy of the residential school system and to advance reconciliation. Now, one of the best pieces of advice I've ever was given was, as individuals, we do not have to do all 94 calls to action. That's not our burden. These calls to action call out specifically the municipal, the provincial, as well as the federal government. But we can do action towards these calls to action. And so the advice is find that area of your interest, your passion, and then focus those actions towards addressing that call to action and addressing that passion. So we're going to take a closer look first at the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and then I'm going to jump down to those 2 calls to action specifically. Now, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the thing that needs to be said about reconciliation really is it's not just about Indigenous peoples. There's a crucial role non-Indigenous people have to play, and it's not just about supporting the healing, but to undergo their own transformation as well. So there's an internationally accepted principle that when a crime is committed, the victim is protected against that crime from being committed or repeated again. Now, in the case of Canada and the United States, it means addressing the belief that Indigenous peoples, cultures are unworthy of dignity and respect. It also means accepting that Indigenous peoples must have the freedom to make their own decisions and to say no when the governments try to impose those decisions. Now, that may seem very simple, but requires non-Indigenous Canadians to also accept that fundamental change in the status quo. Now, when the TRC set out the 10 principles of reconciliation, the very first one was that the United Nations Declaration and its affirmation of the self-determination needs to be incorporated in this framework of reconciliation. Now, what is a framework of reconciliation? Well, it's one where our corporate sector, our legal systems, our institutions, religious and education, our civil society function in ways that are consistent with the Declaration. Now, by adopting the Declaration, the Government of Canada is making progress towards achieving consensus when it comes to the minimum standards necessary for the survival, dignity, and well-being. Now, this declaration consists of 23 preambular clauses, 46 articles that describe a variety of rights that and actions governments must take to protect Indigenous rights. Now, these, of course, are not brand new rights. They are simply rights that are already enshrined in other documents. Now, just a few years ago, there was Bill C-15, an act respecting the Declaration, which saw and received royal assent in 2021. Now, this act, its purpose is to affirm the Declaration as a universal human rights instrument that can be applicable to Canadian law, and then provide a framework for the government to implement the Declaration. Now, the Government of Canada must, in consultation and cooperation, take all measures necessary to ensure the laws are consistent with the Declaration. And they also must have to develop an action plan on how they're going to achieve the objectives of the Declaration. This action plan has yet to be released. Now, there were two articles that I wanted to highlight specifically when it came to media, numbers 15 and number 16. 15 being, Indigenous people have the right and dignity for a diversity of their cultures, traditions, histories, aspirations reflected in education and public material accurately. The second is that states should take effective measures, again, in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples, to combat prejudice, eliminate discrimination, promote tolerance, understanding, and good relations. Now, the second article I wanted to highlight, number 16, says Indigenous people have the right to establish their own media in their own language and to have access to all forms of non-Indigenous media without discrimination. The second part says states shall take effective measures to ensure that state-owned media duly reflect Indigenous cultural diversity, and again, states have to ensure without prejudice the full freedom of expression and encourage that privately owned media also adequately reflect Indigenous cultural diversity and Indigenous peoples. So is the Declaration legally binding? Well, at this time, technically no. The Declaration, like other UN declarations, is not legally binding, but it represents a set of principles and legal norms that reflect the commitments the states have made to this document. So as I said, it doesn't create new rights, but affirms the rights Indigenous peoples already have and provides a detailed human rights list enshrined in other international documents. Now, with that, again, why is this so important? Again, it's because for the Canadian context of Bill C-15, that act respecting the Declaration, and the fact that we're going to be seeing, hopefully in the near future, the development of that action plan on how they're going to be addressing the articles throughout Canadian law. Now, when it comes to this presentation, what I had brought with me isn't necessarily a guide on how to fulfill reconciliation or how to advance reconciliation. We do a lot of work at the National Center, a lot of being education awareness with a focus on residential schools, the residential school experience. So what I brought with me are a set of questions related to those two UN Declaration articles, but also a series of questions for you to take with you when it comes to how is your organization, how is your department addressing reconciliation? Are they wanting to address reconciliation? What are those first questions to ask when exploring this? So the first set of ones I have are related to Article 15. So when it comes to Article 15, numbers 1 and 2, the questions are, how does your organization, how does your department review what content is being released about Indigenous peoples in news articles, online, or through media, through the television? How are they ensuring that the diversity of Indigenous cultures, those traditions, histories, aspirations, are appropriately reflected when this information is released to the public? As mentioned, one of the barriers to reconciliation is myths and stereotypes about Indigenous people. And oftentimes what we hear from newcomers coming to Canada is that their perspective of Canada and of Indigenous peoples is informed by media and stories that they see, whether positive or negative. And unfortunately, the focus and the angle of it is often on a negative experience. Another question to ask is, how does your department, your organization, communicate with Indigenous peoples and communities? How does it engage in that cooperative back and forth? What sort of relationships exist? Do they exist? Are they non-existent? Are they in a poor shape? Are they in a good shape? And is this something that can be assessed on a regular basis? And again, that question is, how is the organization working to combat prejudice, eliminate discrimination, and promote tolerance? Is it, in fact, doing the opposite by the policies and procedures and the taken for granted things that are occurring in the workplace? And when it comes to the second article, number 16, some of the questions to ask, and one is a repeat, is how accessible is news content to Indigenous communities that you serve? Is it accessible? Is it in appropriate language? Is it in a variety of different languages? Think about multiple means of access as well. Is it available in those remote communities where the story might be about them? Or how do they gain that access? And then again, that question is, how are we ensuring that diversity exists when we show or depict Indigenous peoples in the media, in the news? Now, my next set of questions are more general. And it's, again, related to kind of what the status is. So at this moment in time, how would you describe your organization's history with Indigenous communities, whether local, regional, or national? And again, is it a good relationship? Is it a bad one? Is it non-existent? Does one need to be built? And this really gives you all a starting point, an assessment to determine what are the steps that need to be done regarding reconciliation. For instance, as I said, in a lot of cases, a reconciliation is about rebuilding trust. So the question is, what activities are being done to build trust with communities? Is there a standard community-based contact where they know this is the person from this media outlet or this organization who I can trust to gather information or to connect with me? And again, how can they trust that your organization or department is going to accurately depict members of their community when historically that has not been the case? Trust, is that really accurate? And really, those second questions I have here, are there past wrongs that need to be repaired or corrected? Are there past wrongs that first need to even be acknowledged? Because we really can't start building trust until we get a good sense as to that relationship. Now, as I said, we're going to take a closer look at two specific calls to action, number 92 and number 84. I'm going to do number 92 first because it is much broader than the specific calls to action for media. So the call to action number 92, it's very similar to number 57, and I'm throwing lots of numbers at you, so I have the text up on screen as well. 92 calls upon the corporate sector in Canada to adopt the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as that framework, apply its principles, norms, and standards to policy and operational activities, as well as ensure there are three pieces here. Number one, commit to meaningful consultation, building respectful relationships, and obtaining free, prior, and informed consent from Indigenous peoples before moving on with projects. Number two is ensuring that Indigenous peoples have equitable access to jobs, training, education opportunities, and that Indigenous communities gain long-term sustainable benefits from projects. And number three is providing education and training. Now, this education and training is very broad. It's on everything from the history of Indigenous peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools and colonial systems, that Declaration of Rights, treaties and Indigenous rights, Indigenous law, Aboriginal Crown relations. And in addition to this knowledge, it also includes training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. And that's quite a lot that needs to be achieved when it comes to the public as well as the private sector. So when taking a look at how do we address call to action number 92, well, we can take a look at the development of long-term planning for this education, but also considering short-term planning. So for instance, right now, you are working on call to action number 92 by participating in this event. But we also have to take a look at things like not only lectures and presentations from speakers, survivors, and other individuals, but the importance of experiential learning. We know this is a really great way to ensure that individuals, especially at the executive level or their higher levels, have that buy-in to understand why this is so necessary. Because there's also remote and online training, identifying experts and guests, retention and upgrades. How is this information continuing to develop over time? And how is it being monitored and evaluated to ensure that there's progress being documented? And this, again, includes a variety of topics. So I've listed just a few here. So the history of colonial relationships, the history of communities, both local, again, those communities you're serving, but also regional and national. Thinking about the history of your own organizations, again, relationship. territorial acknowledgements, cultural protocols, resources on topics like treaties, residential schools, boarding schools, and the like, resources for reconciliation, but also time for reflection and group development. Now, one of the easiest ways to get training and education out to individuals is through online learning. So, online learning has a number of challenges, but also positives associated with it. Number one, it's economic. You can get a lot of education done for a little bit less than, say, experiential learning. But the downside of that is it doesn't allow for that person-to-person connection. It's very difficult to get that experiential piece when all you're doing is looking at a computer screen, watching a video, and oftentimes in presentations, those video feeds are turned off. I'm looking at a lot of question marks or blank spaces. Sharing on a visceral level is so important. Relationships and relationality need to be highlighted. It's one way, for instance, to develop that relationship is for the fact that I can give this beautiful presentation, lecture, but it can go in one ear, out one other. Unless I'm making that heart-to-heart connection, things aren't really going to change. And so it can be difficult to create that emotional connection. But again, it can reach a lot of people very quickly. So with that, it can be easier to mandate that training, which then begs the question, mandatory versus voluntary. We see a lot of organizations and groups get a little resistant when we talk about mandatory training because there needs to be a balance with it, because it can be very easy to accidentally repel staff if they see that they're forced to do this in some way and they don't have that understanding why it needs to be done. So there are a number of institutions where health and safety training is mandatory, and so this is one of the ways we recommend people slip in this sort of training as a requirement. We talk about Indigenous learning, we talk about creating safe spaces for Indigenous employees, emotionally, culturally, physically, spiritually, and if Indigenous education is framed in this concept of safety, then mandatory training is seen as more acceptable. So organizations can include this education without that piece by embedding it into recent new staff orientation or onboarding and train the trainers as well as that cultural safety component. Now, some of the questions I wanted you to take away are related to this area, and I think I might have, yes, I think I jumped over a section here. Or it simply disappeared. It's quite possible I may have accidentally deleted it. So I'm going to keep on going. Now, when it comes to Call to Action 92, focusing on part 3 here, some of the questions to ask are, what sort of training or learning opportunities currently exist for all staff? Whether it's on Indigenous peoples, colonial policies, or any of those areas I highlighted. One area to focus on is to see whether or not staff have participated in programs offered by, say, the University of Saskatchewan, Alberta, Toronto, Victoria, Sanyas cultural training, or Indigenous works training. You're also looking at what sort of learning exists around that intercultural competency, conflict resolution, as well as anti-racism training. Now, when it comes to those other areas, I'm just going to pull up the calls to action here. So the first question is, when it comes to the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, what's currently being done to ensure that the Declaration and its principles, norms, and standards are incorporated into policy, into core operational activities, and whether or not there is a plan that exists. Maybe there's not, and this is the area or time to start discussing the potential of a plan. You're also looking at, again, what is meaningful consultation? What does that look like? How are we building those relationships? What does free, prior, and informed consent look like? The informed bit is easy. It's the the free part is easy. It's the prior and informed part that is difficult. Oftentimes, you're wanting to ensure information gets to communities with enough time for it to be reviewed in an accessible means, and that, again, they have that opportunity to say no. We're also looking, again, questions related to jobs and training. What sort of jobs are currently available for those who are just entering into this field, but also those who are a little bit further along that journey? Now, I mentioned we were going to take a little bit of a closer look at Call to Action number 84, specific to media. So this one is very specific to CBC and Radio Canada, but again, it can be applied to any organization. And it says, we call upon the federal government to restore and increase funding to CBC to enable the national broadcaster to support reconciliation and properly reflect the diversity of culture, language, and perspective of Indigenous peoples. And there are 6 areas to this. There are 3 areas to this. Number 1, increasing Indigenous programming, including Indigenous language speakers. Number 2, increasing equitable access to jobs, leadership positions, as well as professional development opportunities. And number 3 is continuing to provide dedicated news coverage, online public information, and resources of issues that are of concern to Indigenous peoples and Canadians, including that history and legacy of residential schools and reconciliation. So with that, I have a number of questions for you to take when it comes to call to action number 84. Number 1 is the amount of Indigenous programming being tracked in your organization or in your department? If it is, fantastic. But how detailed is that tracking? If it's not being tracked, why not? Is this something that can be instituted? What is preventing the tracking of this information from happening? Now, the second is, has Indigenous programming increased since the release of the calls to action, or with recent attention on residential schools or boarding schools, or on missing children or unmarked burials? Because again, if you remember what I talked about regarding some of the barriers is, well, we are unable to track if there's meaningful change unless we're gathering the data to depict that change. We're also looking at whether or not has funding increased for programming. What kind of programming has seen an increase in funding? What programming does exist that needs attention, or are there specific gaps that exist that need to be addressed? And when it comes to that funding, is it proportional? Are there some areas that are receiving more funding than others, and is there a reason for that? You're also looking at whether or not current programming, is it reflective of Indigenous culture, Indigenous history? And again, what languages are currently reflected in programming? Here in Canada, of course, while we have 2 official languages, we have many, many Indigenous languages. I believe there are 73 or 80, if I remember correctly, but that's not even including the variety of dialects that exist. And when it comes to part 2, increasing equitable access to jobs and leadership positions, those questions to ask are, is there a means for employees, for staff members to self-identify? Are individuals self-identifying? Is it safe for them to self-identify? Why or why not? Is there representation of Indigenous groups here in Canada for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit? For your region here in Manitoba, for instance, we have 7 Indigenous nations. And here is a test to see whether or not I can remember all 7 of them right now. There is a push also to switch from using Indigenous names like Cree and Ojibwe to the terms that are used directly in communities. So I'm still practicing in some cases. So we have Anishinaabeg, we have Ininu, we have Anishinawak, we have the Desalunin, the Métis, the Inuit, and I'm missing one other, unfortunately. I'll see if it comes back to me. But then considering, again, for your own regions, how many Indigenous groups are there? Are they being reflected within that programming or within the news coverage? And when it comes to staff, are there recruitment plans that specifically target Indigenous peoples to increase those numbers? And again, unless there is self-identification happening, or even if that's a possibility, it's very difficult to determine how many are in staff and if there is a proportionate number of them. You're also, again, looking at what kind of entry-level positions are there for those just coming out of journalism school or other areas, what kind of upward mobility exists, if there is any, as well as ensuring that are there policies that support employees occupying space comfortably and supporting culture and identity. Now, I don't have time today, but one of the areas I'd like to talk about is called micro-reconciliation. And what it basically states is that cultural competency programming and education is not enough to address systemic racism that we see in our institutions. What we need is the ability to show moral courage, to acknowledge that systemic racism exists, it's everywhere, and that we are able to call it out and begin working on it. Now, in combination of these education programs and cultural competency, micro-reconciliation is a way to address racism in the system as well as systemic racism. And it's one area that I recommend taking a look at in the future. But other questions I often ask employers is when it comes to that culturally safe space, supportive culture and identity, a very basic question is, what's your policy on bereavement leave? For a lot of organizations, it is 1, 2, maybe 3 days, depending on your relation to that relative. Where we know a lot of communities, they have to travel multiple days. For instance, if you're the firekeeper, maintaining that 4-day fire, and it might take several days for you to get to that community in the first place. Another one is there ability to take time off to engage in ceremony or other cultural activities? We know, for instance, those who participate in the Sundance, that's a multi-year commitment. And if you miss that opportunity 1 year, you have to start from the very beginning again and start through that commitment once more. Is there that opportunity to take time off to fulfill those cultural commitments or activities? Now, a couple more slides on questions, and then I'm going to start sharing some resources. Now, do Indigenous employees have equitable access to leadership roles? Are they supported with training and education to get to those leadership roles? Are those, is there documentation that's determining how Indigenous talent is being retained? Isn't Indigenous talent coming in, but leaving quite quickly because that support and policy to support them is lacking? You're also looking again, where is that professional development? Is it available? And again, are Indigenous employees taking advantage if there is programming available? In some of these other areas, we're asking, how are staff engaging in intercultural competency training outside of the organization? Are there ways in which Indigenous specific organizations and communities in training and programs can do this outside? What sort of partnerships exist with other institutions or Indigenous organizations? And are efforts from staff being recognized? Also, for instance, there are a number of days of action, remembrance, recognition, one of them which here in Canada is September 30th. Are these days being recognized within your organization and department? So this is my last set of questions and slides here, and I saw a number of pictures taken. Please feel free to take pictures, that's not a problem. I'll also note that we have a booth over the next 2 days, and so I'll have a document printout for you available where you can take a snapshot to download the full PowerPoint slide deck if you so choose, including all these questions to take with you. So in part 3, that's continuing to provide dedicated news coverage and information about Indigenous peoples. And so, again, here's that question I asked earlier. Who monitors what information is actually released? Who determines whether or not that information is correct? Is it appropriate? Is it accurate? Is there a process to address something if there's misinformation that's released? I also want to, again, consider the language that's used in articles about, say, a focus on crime, Indigenous perpetrators and victims. For instance, what sort of language is being used? How are they being described? What sort of images are being used? And we also look at what's the proportion of news on negative stories versus positive stories. Is there a balance that we see? And again, is there a balance on the types of news being covered? And so lastly, some of these questions are, where is the information getting sourced from and how is it reviewed? And as I shared earlier already, what are steps that can be taken to correct misinformation if it gets out there? So I'm throwing a lot of information at you, a lot of questions for you to take with you, but now I'm going to cover some resources that can be assisting for yourself or, again, to assist others. Really, a lot of this is about education and awareness, but the take action piece is sharing what you know, what you has benefited from, and sharing it with others, colleagues, individuals who could use this information themselves, and then we'll take time for questions. So for a lot of individuals who miss that opportunity to learn about Indigenous history, culture, as well as current issues here in Canada, there are several courses that you can take online for free. The most popular one, and I'm sure one you've heard of, is the University of Alberta's Indigenous Canada course. But there's also the University of Toronto's Worldview in Education course and the University of Victoria's Reconciliation Through Education course, all of which are self-directed learning online, and the only time that you pay is if you're looking for that certification, that certificate. I've taken the University of Alberta's 12-module course, and it was all right. It wasn't too bad. It was 12 modules, as I mentioned, self-directed videos, readings, as well as some other activities that gave greater exploration of some of that history from pre-contact to contact, but also taking a look at key issues Indigenous communities are facing today, both from a historical and critical perspective. Now, you can also take cultural safety and competency training courses. There are a great number of them that exist. What I have up on screen is just a drop in the bucket. The one that I'll highlight is the Sanyas Cultural Safety Training Program, which was developed at the province of British Columbia, which focuses on enhancing self-awareness, strengthening skills on how to engage Indigenous peoples. And so the goal of the training is to develop an understanding to promote that positive partnership. Now, facilitators guide individuals through interactive course material where they examine culture, stereotyping, the consequences and legacy of colonization, in addition to terminology, diversity, aspects of colonial history like residential schools and Indian hospitals. But in addition to cultural competency and training courses, I also like to talk about what I call insight courses. Now, there are 2 insight courses here in Winnipeg that I highly recommend, one of which is also can be done virtually, which is the Circles for Reconciliation program. Circles for Reconciliation is an organization that brings together 6 Indigenous and 6 non-Indigenous individuals over 10 weeks to discuss a variety of topics. The first one being they released was about the 94 calls to action. But they also have content geared towards the treaties and treaty relationships, about the Indian Act, as well as other auxiliary topics that can be explored. And so, as I mentioned, there are virtual gatherings for Circles for Reconciliation, but there are also circles across Canada as well. Another insight course is Returning to Spirit, which is a nonprofit organization aimed at getting a better understanding of reconciliation through respect, trust, and equality. And one of the testimonials I had from an individual who was non-Indigenous said, for her, she understood the concept of reconciliation, but for her, she was having a hard time bridging it. And this course assisted her in the fact that she got a better understanding about her unconscious bias and these feelings toward herself, specifically, I should say, and with that understanding that community and others care about me. And so there is a 2-way path. And so with that, I have this understanding that I care about them, or I'm developing that care and empathy towards others as well. Now, when it comes to courses, business training, there are a number of areas that provide certification. For instance, there is Indigenous Works, which was formerly the Aboriginal Human Rights Council, which was founded as a nonprofit to improve inclusion and engagement of Indigenous people in the economy. So they offer online training, advisory services, workplace inclusion diagnostics, and they also assist in the development of partnership skills and strategies to improve that relationship. There is also the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, which provides an array of business development offerings and certification for Indigenous as well as non-Indigenous businesses and companies. They provide what's known as the Progressive Aboriginal Relations, or the PAR certificate program, to confirm corporate performance when it came to Indigenous relations. Other resources or places I'll highlight is visiting sites of former residential schools, research centers, sites of promise. So here I have just a few specific to Canada. So if you look to the British Columbia, you have the Residential School History and Dialogue Center, but there's also St. Eugene's Resort, a former residential school which turned into a it's a spa resort, but also golf course. But in addition to that, they have a cultural education and learning center there as well that's guided by community elders and knowledge keepers. If we go to Ontario, there's the Shingwauk Residential School Center, also known as Algoma University. There you'll see the original residential school is still standing and has been repurposed today as the research center in the basement, but also it includes exhibit space about that history of the Shingwauk Residential School and recently developed other engagement space. And there's also the Woodlands Cultural Center, also another former residential school, the Mohawk Institute, which now promotes Indigenous history, language, arts, and culture. They have a very good virtual tour of the Mohawk Institute. So if you are looking for something for groups to do for upcoming September or September 30th, that's a very good means to connect with history, listen to a survivor, an elder, and get a tour of that former site. But other areas of learning include books. There are a great number of books, and in fact, if you type in Indigenous literature with CBC attached to it, you're going to find lists for the 20th, 21st, 22nd, and 23rd. So 4 years in a row, about 30 to 50 books each, talking about a variety of topics. So what I have here is just a very small sampling, one being The Inconvenient Indian by Thomas King, that takes a look at the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples and how popular culture has shaped Indigenous identity. What other books to look at are 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. A lot of individuals don't know about the 1953 amendments to the Indian Act regarding the Indian health regulations, which made it illegal for an Indigenous person to refuse to see a doctor, to refuse to go to hospital, and if they left before being discharged, the RCMP could be sent after them, either to be brought to jail or back to that healthcare facility. Now, when it comes to other books, there are, of course, great guiding documents like the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the TRC Calls to Action, and the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. I do recommend taking a look at the 231 Calls for Justice. And you say, wow, that's a lot more than the 94. But what was really unique about them is for the fact that they divided them up into calls for service providers, calls for government, distinction-based calls for the Métis, Inuit, as well as Two-Spirit people, and then there are 8 calls for justice directed at all Canadians to help address and combat prejudice as well as violence. Now, for anyone who may know Winnipeg and may know me, I am a film aficionado. Here in the city, I run what's called the Decolonizing Lens, a hybrid-based event that showcases the works and words of Indigenous artists here and beyond. And for me, I find film is a really great way to make that heart-to-heart connection. And so there are a great number of films that have been released that touch upon not only this history through documentaries and storytelling, but also sci-fi advanced stories and other fun adventures. So here are just a few that I've highlighted here. So Beans, take a look at the Oka crisis through the eyes of a young girl. There's Home from School, the look of the repatriation of 3 children from the Carlisle, Pennsylvania school in the United States. There's Night Riders, which is a post-apocalyptic film about a mother working with a vigilante group to break her child out of a residential type school. One of my favorites is Slashback. It is a film about several young Inuk girls from the community of Pangertang who have to fight off an alien invasion using their movie horror knowledge and their weapons. And it's exactly, it's like The Thing. It's lots of fun. And so when we talk about, sharing this history, sharing this culture, the diversity of stories, it's through things like this as well. But there's other films like For Love, take a look at the child welfare crisis here in Canada, as well as Rosie, which was released last year, about an Indigenous girl who must go live with her street smart francophone auntie and her 2 gender-bending friends in Montreal in the 1980s. There's also a great number of podcasts that exist. Of course, we had Connie Walker's one that recently received the Pulitzer Prize, Stolen from St. Michael's. And again, this is a very good way, one that I often recommend individuals if they're driving, doing a commute, anything along those lines. This is a good way to learn more of this history. Now I see I love to talk and I'm nearly out of time, so I'm going to highlight one or two more things and then I'll take pause. So other things you can do is discover what land or territory you're on. There are 2 really great websites, Whose Land and nativeland.ca, that depict the territory, not only through different treaties and language groups, but also throughout all of Canada, the United States, and in some cases, one map is the full world. And so you can browse how First Nations names may be pronounced if you're unfamiliar with that region or territory, watch sample land acknowledgements, and go from there. But other areas that we often recommend individuals work upon is following Indigenous leaders, activists, academics, and organizations through social media. Individuals like Negan Sinclair, Cindy Blackstock, Autumn Pelchy, Pam Palmader. Sign up for newsletters and support public campaigns like Shannon's Dream or Walking with Our Angels. Now, one area we often recommend folks engage is bring in knowledge keepers, survivors to share their knowledge with others. You can do so by attending exhibits, screenings, or events put on by community, or engaging in any number of those days of action, remembrance, or recognition, but also buying Indigenous-made products or engaging Indigenous suppliers or encouraging that at your department or organization. So as I shared, I have a great number of days of action, remembrance, and recognition. This is just one page that I've pulled together for the days of July to October. So upcoming August 12th is the International Day of Youth to celebrate youth leadership, amplify youth voices, raise awareness. But in September and October in Canada, we have School as a Time for Dreams, all about supporting equitable access to education. On September 30th, we have Orange Shirt Day, or the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. On October 4th, we have just one of the couple days of action for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. And then looking further on, November 7th is Inuit Day, or the International Circumpolar Inuit Day, to celebrate and amplify their voices. November 8th, Indigenous Veterans Day here in Canada. We also have December 10th, the Human Rights Day, to commemorate the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this is just a very small sampling of some of those days, but we also pull up, for instance, the anniversaries of the signing of treaties. So just recently, we just had the anniversary for the signing of Treaty 1 territory, which we're in right now, which occurred in 1871. So we recently had, I believe it was, I'm bad at math. It was either the 125th or the 150th anniversary of the signing just a few years ago. But other areas that I wanted to highlight is staying up to date with the calls to action. I find it less and less helpful to provide individuals with an update on specific calls to action because there's change happening at different rates. And so these are three organizations that I use: Indigenous Watchdog, CBC Beyond 94, as well as the Government of Canada, to get updates where the calls to action are, what sort of levels of government have addressed them, what are areas that need to be addressed, what Indigenous organizations are doing to address those calls to action. The area that I would, that I think I'll end on before we wrap up here is sharing with others resources on allyship. These are 4 resources that were talked about in the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls and Two-Spirit People inquiry. There was Amnesty International's 10 Ways to be a Genuine Ally, Dr. Lynn Gahill's 16 Bills of the Ally Bill of Responsibilities. There is the Indigenous Perspective Society's How to be an Ally, but the one that I really like and the one that you see pictured is the Montreal Urban Aboriginal Community Strategy Network, their Indigenous Ally Toolkit. And the reason why I like it so much is that it's a little folding card, and it speaks very simply by stating that to be an ally is to use your voice and speak up when others can't, to transfer your benefits and privileges that you have to support others, that the struggle isn't about you. You may be assisting it, but the focus isn't on you. And then again, that we're all able to do this work together. It's cooperative, it's collaborative, and it's something that we can continue to do and advance as we go forward. So I've come to the end of my presentation. I have a final slide here that just has my contact information, but also contacts for our center, our archive. For instance, if you're looking to get access to residential school records or research, we have the email up there. It will get to the right place. But again, if you're looking for more information on, say, presentation or workshop on accessing records, how to review records, going a little deeper than what we had time for today, say, what does reconciliation planning look like? What do we do with reconciliation planning? I have my email up there, which is my first and last name, kaila.johnston@umanitoba.ca, as well as the telephone numbers. But with that, thank you very much. So I see there's a microphone in the middle of the room. I don't know how comfortable people feel about the microphone. So if that's the case, just feel free to come up to me here at the front. I'm more than happy to discuss on a more quiet level if your preference is that.